Hey, what's up, 8 Bush kids? We're back today for AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topic 7.12, World War II Mobilization. Our learning objective today is learning objective 7L, which has explained how and why US participation in World War II transformed American society. Our first key idea today says the mass mobilization of American society helped end the Great Depression, and the country's strong industrial base played a pivotal role in winning the war by equipping and provisioning allies and millions of U.S. troops. Now, as in World War I, the U.S. government organized a number of special agencies to mobilize U.S. economic and military resources for the wartime crisis. Early in 1942, the War Production Board was established to manage war industries. Later, the Office of War Mobilization, OWM, set production priorities and controlled raw materials. The government used what was called a cost-plus system, which had paid war contractors the cost of production plus a certain percentage for profit. Now, war-related industrial output in the United States was astonishing. By 1944, it was twice that of all the Axis powers combined. Instead of automobiles, tanks and fighter planes rolled off the assembly lines. American factories produced over 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, and ships with a total capacity of 53 million tons. So efficient were production methods that Henry Kaiser's giant shipyard in California could turn out a new ship in just 14 days. The war concentrated production in the largest corporations, as smaller businesses lost out on government contracts to larger businesses with more capacity. The 100 largest corporations accounted for up to 70% of wartime manufacturing. In addition to this, the War Powers Act gave President Roosevelt the power to expand the government, use censorship, and limit personal liberties, such as freedom of speech, something we've seen in many prior wartime crises. Now, the government paid for its huge increase in spending, nearly $100 billion spent on the war in 1945 alone, by doing a few things. Number one, increasing the income tax, and number two, selling war bonds. For the first time, most Americans were required to pay an income tax, and in 1944, the practice was begun off automatically by deducting a withholding tax from paychecks. Borrowing money by selling $135 billion in war bonds supplemented the tax increase. In addition, the shortage of consumer goods made it easier for Americans to save, just like during World War I. Now, few people opposed the war, so the government's propaganda campaign of posters, songs, and news bulletins was primarily to maintain public morale, to encourage people to conserve resources, and to increase war production. The Office of War Information controlled news about troop movements and battles. Movies, radio, and popular music all supported and reflected a cheerful, patriotic view of the war. For example, Norman Rockwell's popular illustrations of the Four Freedoms captured the liberties and values at stake in the war. The unity of Americans behind the war's democratic ideals helped that generation remember it as the Good War. Now, one federal agency, the Office of Price Administration, or OPA, regulated almost every aspect of civilian lives by freezing wages, prices, and rents, and rationing such commodities as meat, sugar, gasoline, and auto tires, primarily to fight wartime inflation. People could be given those ration stamps like you see on the left-hand side. In addition to this, Americans recycled and planted victory gardens, all in the effort to help support the war effort. In addition to this, war production created new jobs, it stimulated the economy, and, as we can see from this chart right here, it helped to end the Great Depression. Leading us to key idea number 2, which says mobilization provided opportunities for women and minorities to improve their socioeconomic positions for the war's duration, while also leading to debates over racial segregation. Wartime experience also generated challenges to civil liberties, such as the internment of Japanese Americans. Now, during World War II, African Americans fought in the military and at home. 1 million young African American men will leave home to serve in the armed forces, and whether as soldiers or civilians, all face continued discrimination and segregation, such as the black soldiers that were allowed to fight as Tuskegee Airmen. Now, they were later recognized for their heroism during the war. Now, World War II also created thousands of war-related factory jobs, as well as a demand for workers. And the Second Great Migration began as blacks moved to northern cities and especially to the West Coast. Now, African Americans faced racial discrimination in segregated units and in war-related jobs. Now, white resentment in urban areas led to dozens dying in race riots in New York and Detroit during the summer of 1943. Civil rights leaders encouraged African Americans to adopt the Double V slogan, one for victory over fascism abroad and one for equality at home. Membership in the NAACP increased during the war. Another civil rights organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, otherwise known as CORE, was formed in 1942 by civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph. After the war, afterwards, black leaders threatened a protest march on Washington, D.C. Now, as a result, the Roosevelt administration issued an executive order numbered 8802 to prohibit discrimination in government and businesses that received federal contracts. And to enforce this, they created the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Now, as in World War I, an acute labor shortage caused women to take jobs vacated by men in uniform. Almost 6 million women entered the workforce, many of them working in industrial jobs in the shipyards and defense plants. The number of married women in the workforce increased by 24%. A song about Rosie the Riveter was used to encourage women to take defense jobs. However, they received pay well below that of male factory workers. Now, during the war, over 200,000 women are going to serve in uniform in the Army, Navy, and Marines. However, most of them will serve in non-combat roles, such as the WWIIs, as you can see there. They'll also work in the Women's Army Corps as well as serving as nurses and photographers as well. Women's participation in the war effort led to an increase in daycare centers, as well as more child delinquency in the United States during this time period. However, after the war, we do see that women were generally forced out of these high-paying factory jobs. Now, more than any other ethnic group, Japanese Americans suffered from their association with wartime enemies. Americans viewed the Japanese as racially inferior and used racial stereotypes to describe the enemy as well as Japanese Americans. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were suspected of being potential spies and saboteurs, and a Japanese invasion of the West Coast was considered imminent by many. In 1942, these irrational fears, as well as racism, prompted the U.S. government to order over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast to leave their homes and reside in the barracks of internment camps. This Executive Order 9066 relocated these Japanese Americans away from the coastline. We can see some of those examples of these relocations in the pictures on the screen. Now, Japanese Americans living in other parts of the United States, including Hawaii, did not come under this order. In the case of Karamatsu v. U.S. in 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the U.S. government's internment policy as justified during wartime. Now, the Japanese Americans in internment camps faced bad living conditions and a lack of civil rights. Years later, in 1988, the federal government agreed that the ruling in the Korematsu case was unjust and awarded financial compensation to those still alive who had been interned. Leading us to key idea number 3. Migration in the United States from Mexico and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere increased, in spite of contradictory government policies towards Mexican immigration. Now, increased demands for labor led to a reversal of the government's policy of forcing Mexicans out of the Southwest. And many Mexican Americans worked in defense industries. Over 300,000 served in the military. A 1942 agreement with Mexico allowed Mexican farm workers, known as barracos, to enter the United States in the harvest season without going through formal immigration procedures. Now, the sudden influx of Mexican immigrants into Los Angeles stirred white resentment and led to the so-called Zoot Suit Riot in the summer of 1943, in which whites and Mexican Americans battled on the streets. As a result, over 600 Mexican Americans, though few whites, were arrested as a result of the violence. So in summary today, we've talked about some of the different and home front implications of World War II. We should understand that there are several implications, both economic and social implications, especially for minority groups, including Japanese Americans, African Americans, women, and Hispanic Americans. And many of them mirror those same home front implications as what happened during World War I. We should also understand that the United States government is able to take over the U.S. economy during the war and is able to change not only what we're making, how we're making it, but also limit our personal liberties and freedoms while it does so. Well, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and until next time, as always, go Pack.